Hi, welcome to this short video, and today's topic is going to be covering off a question that I get asked quite a few times. If I want to get into amateur radio, what do I need? So the idea of today is nothing more than to cover off some of the things that you will need as a new amateur to get into the hobby. Before we start, there's a few things that you, as the new amateur, will need to get straight in your mind in terms of how you want to work your hobby. So there's a few decisions that you need to make before you even start looking at radios or deciding kind of what aerials you want or anything like that. So let's go through the decisions that really you need to make in the right kind of order that you need to make them. So first thing, do you want to buy new or used? Obviously, if you buy new equipment, number one, it's going to cost more, invariably. However, you do tend to get guarantees, and also you tend to get the assurance that somebody hasn't had the lid off and started messing around inside it. If you do decide that you want to buy brand new, then there's many places where you can buy it, either shops that you can go into and you can see them and you can touch them, and sometimes they'll even let you actually use them. You can even buy them off the internet, maybe at a bit of a saving. If you are happy to buy a second-hand or a used item, then you could potentially be looking at saving, maybe 50%. However, there is a risk. There's a risk that it's not going to work or not going to work in the way that you want it to work. There's no guarantees typically unless you're buying a used item from a reputable seller. Many of the ham radio shops do sell used equipment, and they carry guarantees. But if you choose to buy it from any of the online auction sites, eBay, Amazon, Gumtree, even Facebook, you can find used amateur radio Facebook sites. Also, specifically in the UK, there's a couple of sites. Ham Radio Deals is one of them, and also G3CWI's Flea Market is a really good site. So there's your choices in terms of, first things first, brand new or second hand. The next thing you've got to understand is how you want to work, or your MO, your modus operandi. You've got a number of choices again. So in the car or in the van, mobile is what we call that. Home base, or in the shack. Portable, walking up a hill, walking the dog in a field. So you've got those kind of choices. You've also got a few more choices, but I won't cover those at the moment. So you need to understand where you'll be using the equipment. The bands, okay? Now this is a phrase that you might not be familiar with, but when radio amateurs talk about bands, what they're talking about really is the frequencies that you want to use. Do you want to operate HF or VHF or UHF? Those are choices that you've got to make, and depending on what you choose will determine what radio you actually end up buying. You've also then got, once you've worked out the bands that you want to operate on, you've then got to work out what modes you want to operate on, okay? So let's say, for instance, you're into talking to the people in your local neighbourhood. There's not much point in you saying, I want to talk to the people around me within 30 miles, therefore I'll go out and I'll buy a radio that is capable of doing 20 meters. Okay, 20 meters is around 14 megahertz. Okay, to keep things simple. Because 20 meters, you'll find it very hard to talk to the guy 20 miles away. Not impossible, but hard. Because 20 meters is really good for talking to the station that's 2,000 or 3,000 miles away. Okay. Equally, if you decide that you want to talk to, let's say, stations 2,000 or 3,000 miles away, there's no point in choosing VHF, because the chances of you ever getting that kind of distance on VHF is slim. Not impossible, just slim. Okay, so these are the kind of choices that you need to make. How will you get your enjoyment? In terms of modes, this is the kind of function of the radio. So FM, frequency modulation, sideband, CW, SSB, these are all choices that you need to make. I won't go into the technical side of what they are and how they work and all this kind of stuff. We're just covering off the choices. But then you also get into things like the digital modes of voice, fusion, DMR, things like that. Again, things for you to research. Then when you get over, I want to be able to talk on the radio, then you start asking yourself the question, well, what else do I want to do? Do I want to do digimodes? Okay, so there are modes that you can plug your computer or your computer talks to your radio and has a conversation with another computer on the other end of the radio. Modes like FT8, FT4, PSK. So those are choices. Do you want to do digimodes? Another choice is, do you want to operate simplex, which is literally one operator talking to the next operator, or do you want to operate duplex? And duplex typically is via a repeater. So for instance, I from here would talk into a repeater. That repeater then takes my signal and broadcasts it out so that people further afield can hear me. So we're actually talking via a device that amplifies and repeats my signal. Okay, so these are choices that you really need to get straight in your mind before you start deciding what radio to buy, because depending on the choices will determine what radio suits your desire. The next thing you need to get straight is the budget. Okay, so if we just look at three different ways of working, three different MOs: handheld, portable, walking up a hill and having a conversation with someone when you get to the top of the hill for whatever reason. Typically you can pick up a handheld setup, everything that you need to be able to achieve that, from maybe £30, $40, all the way up to in excess of £300-400 or $500-600. Okay, so it's definitely, I would say, the cheapest way of getting on amateur radio, and in my mind the most enjoyable, because that's my passion. But anyway, so then we start looking at mobile, so the installation into your car. And by the way, just rewinding a little bit, a handheld radio really requires nothing more than the handheld radio. It comes complete with the aerial on top of it, the batteries inside it, and literally you charge the batteries up and you just start talking on it. That's it, nothing else required. A mobile setup is a little bit more involved, and it requires a bit more investment and a bit more work to install it. So first of all, your radio in your car needs to in some way be fitted in, whether it's just literally temporary, sat on the seat next to you, or bolted in professionally. And some of these radios have got the ability to be mounted in the boot with the actual control panel at the front of the car. So there's a bit of wiring required. Also, they don't have an integral aerial, so you'll need to put an aerial on the roof of your car or your van. So there's a bit more wiring and a bit more expense. And obviously they need to be powered, so there's a bit more wiring and a bit more time stroke money. So realistically, for a mobile setup, in comparison to what I just said about a handheld, for a mobile setup, potentially you could be looking at as little as £100 maybe, up to £1,000, maybe more, depending on how you want to operate. So you're looking at a significant increase in the amount of money. The base station is where it can get really expensive, because the world is your oyster. We're not even simply talking about one radio or two radios. Potentially you could be talking about 5 or even 10 radios, depending on how you want to work. each doing or set up to do a different band or a different way of operating. Multiple antennas, because it's not really that effective to have one antenna that's capable of all the way from 160 meters up to 70 centimeters. That's just really, not possible. You need a power supply to convert from your mains voltage to the voltage that the radio, typically 12 volts is what that will need. Cabling would normally be longer because you would have the aerial on your roof or at the bottom of your garden or in the middle of a field if you're lucky to have a lot of space. So yeah, as I say, many choices need to be made before you even start talking about the radio that you want to buy. So yeah, those are the three areas where you need to really stick a stake in the ground and come up with a figure as far as what your budget is. Now, there are a number of other preferences as well that may drive you down a particular route in terms of what radio. So some people, me, like modern radios, okay? Some people like vintage radios. Some people like ex-military radios. It might be that the place where you're going to be using your radio, whether it's in your car or your van or your boat or your house, hasn't got a lot of space, in which case you need to decide how much space you can afford, so therefore you're not kind of taking up all the space with a great big radio that you literally can't get in the room. You also need to be aware of certain constraints that you physically have. It might be that you're hard of hearing, so therefore you may want to look at a radio with better audio capabilities or external speakers. Could be that you are visually impaired, in which case maybe a small radio isn't really the best choice. Maybe you want a radio that's got a bigger screen or a bigger readout, or even one of the new SDR radios, or a radio that's capable of having its information projected onto a PC screen, so literally you can actually see it better than looking at a little dial. It might be that you choose a simple installation because for whatever reason you don't want the complexities of a full-blown shack, or completely on the opposite side of the coin, you might want a complex solution. It all depends how you feel and how you're happiest. Another thing that you really need to take into account is your neighbourhood. What are your neighbours going to say when you start putting up antennas? So therefore, it could be that your neighbours have more of an influence and an effect on your operation than you do, because it might be that the antennas that you have to use might simply be a wire going from one end of your garden to the next, rather than a great big 30-metre high tower with a number of phased array antennas on top. Obviously, planning permission in certain parts of the world, here in the UK, because land is a lot smaller and a lot more densely populated, we have council planning officers that basically decide what you can and can't do. In certain parts of the world you can get away with putting up great big antennas and not worrying because nobody is around for 30 miles. Also, take into account where you are or where you're going to be operating from. If you live in a valley, then you're probably not going to be very pleased with the performance on bands such as VHF and UHF. If you live on top of a mountain, again you might have fabulous reception on VHF and UHF. However, the problem is because those bands tend to be line of sight typically, you'll have stations coming in and swamping you from all directions, so you might want to consider a directional antenna system rather than an omnidirectional antenna system. So lots and lots and lots of things to take into account, some of which completely out of your control. Just remember this, a lot of people will go out and spend most of the money on the radio because that's the sexy box with all the knobs and dials and all that kind of stuff. And then the next biggest amount of money they'll go out is on the aerial. And then they'll be left over with a little bit of money, and then they'll have to think about how they connect the aerial to the radio. So they'll go out and they'll buy cheap cable, cheap plugs, plug it all in, and then wonder why they're not necessarily getting the performance they expected from a great radio with a fabulous antenna. Well, you need to understand that you can be putting in a great signal from your radio into that coax, but because you've used cheap connectors and cheap coax, by the time that great signal gets to the antenna at the other end, it's not so great anymore. You've actually lost a lot of the power out of that signal. And especially when you're operating on the higher frequencies like UHF and VHF, the quality of the connector means a lot more. HF, you might be able to get away with running lesser quality coax and connectors, but the higher frequencies, try and buy the best quality that you can afford. So you're always going to need a radio, an antenna, and a power supply and the feeder. That's it. Test equipment, an SWR meter is something that you will probably want to invest in at some stage. Maybe not from the outset. 2 meters, for instance, if you're planning on doing 2 meters or 70 centimeters, the antenna that you buy will more than likely be tuned for that band. Only when you start really going to HF do you really want to start looking at SWR and stuff like that. And when you start going into HF, you'll probably also want to look at a tuner, and that is something that basically matches the impedance of the feeder coming off that antenna to your radio. I'm not going to go any more technical than that, but those are things that you don't need from day one, unless you're getting into HF, in which case they probably could be. So there you go. It was only aimed to be a very quick short video. I hope it's been informative for you, and if you have enjoyed it, then please consider subscribing, and there's also a little bell down there that you might just want to press, and then that way you'll get notified whenever there's a new video. Take care for now. Bye bye.